In the waning light of a sweltering southern afternoon, where the sun hung heavy like a molten orb above the sprawling cotton fields, the antebellum South revealed itself in all its harrowing contradictions, magnificent, yet steeped in unspeakable sorrow. The relentless hum of cicadas filled the heavy, humid air, a mournful orchestra underscoring the cruel ballet that was daily life on these plantations. Towering oaks draped in Spanish moss cast long, trembling shadows over the cracked earth, their grotesque branches whispering secrets to the wind, as if mourning the lives tethered to the soil beneath them. It was in this unforgiving landscape that the most grotesque of human transactions took place. A slave auction, where flesh and bones were measured not by their humanity, but by pounds of cotton picked, muscle flexed under the overseer's whip, or the faintest glimmer of youth left to exploit. At the heart of this cruel spectacle stood Baron William Hargrove, a man whose name had long been whispered among the elite planters with a mixture of reverence and fear. Cloaked in velvet tailcoat and top hat that bore the unmistakable marks of wealth and arrogance, the Baron's every movement exuded the cold certainty of a man entrenched in power. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were like twin blades, dissecting the crowd of enslaved souls as if they were mere livestock lined up for inspection. The Baron had made his fortune on these very fields, his cotton empire expanding with each passing year, fueled by the relentless labor and suffering of those bound to his will. As the auctioneer's voice rose above the clamor, loud, commanding, and stripped of any humanity, the spectacle unfolded with brutal precision. Men, women, and children were herded like cattle into the dusty paddock before the grand, albeit weathered mansion that served as the Baron's seat of dominion. Their clothes hung in ragged shreds, faces smudged with the grime of long days spent bending over to pick the thick buds of white cotton, their bodies marked by scars that told stories too painful for words. Among them, the youngest and thinnest were often the cheapest, deemed least worthy of investment, mere burdens in the eyes of their oppressors. On this particular day, a line of enslaved individuals was arrayed for inspection, each one more pitiable than the last. The Baron's gaze swept over them with entitled disdain, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Among the motley group, one figure stood out, not for strength or beauty, but for her spectral frailty. She was a waif, nearly skeletal, draped in tattered remnants of a dress that clung desperately to her gaunt frame. Her hands trembled faintly as she clutched the frayed cloth, eyes downcast, as if retreating from the searing gazes that pierced her. The auctioneer's hammer pounded relentlessly, sending shivers through the assembled crowd, punctuating the callous bids that rang out like death knells. Baron Hargrove let out a derisive laugh, his voice dry and biting, resonating across the dusty yard. The thin girl, whose worth was barely enough to raise an eyebrow among the buyers, was the object of his mockery. "Why waste coin on such a shadow?" he sneered, voice dripping with scorn, "when there are stronger beasts here ready to bear the burden of the fields." The crowd shifted uneasily, some casting furtive glances at the Baron's broad figure, knowing well the cruel power that fed off the center of this gathering. But the fragile girl remained silent, her chest rising in shallow, erratic breaths beneath the weight of a lifetime of suffering and submission. Yet, in the midst of that scornful laughter, a moment unfolded that would unravel the very fabric of Baron Hargrove's existence. The slender slave raised her head, just a fraction, and the sun caught her eyes, vast pools of storm grey that held within them a haunting familiarity and depth. It was as though those eyes carried a silent plea, a flicker of recognition and pain that struck a chord buried deep within the Baron's heart, a place long thought sealed and forsaken. For in those eyes he saw a ghost from his past, a woman he had loved with a passion that bordered on madness, a love lost to time and tragedy. The laughter faltered, the flicker of a long-buried memory igniting beneath the surface of bitterness and bravado. A strange stillness took hold, as if the very air around them had thickened, charged with a tension far beyond the ordinary cruelty of the day. The Baron's lips tightened imperceptibly, his mind torn between contempt and a burgeoning, inescapable doubt. Who was this girl, this ghostly shadow, that dared to meet his gaze and stir the embers of a past he had long tried to forget? Before the crowd, before the auctioneer's relentless call, the Baron made a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. He stepped forward from the crowd, his voice cutting through the murmur like a blade, bidding on the fragile girl not for her body and labor, but for reasons that lay hidden beneath layers of regret and hope. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, for no one could fathom the sudden interest of a man so powerful in one so seemingly insignificant. As the hammer came down and the sale was sealed, the young girl was led away, no longer a mere slave among many, but the reluctant pawn in a story of redemption and revelation. The plantation awaited them, a sprawling domain of cotton fields whispering with ghostly memories, a symbol of both the baron's power and the cruelty it demanded. The mansion, grand yet oppressive, loomed on the horizon, dripping with the heavy weight of untold secrets. It was within those walls that their fates would be irrevocably entwined, and the true nature of the girl's identity would begin to unravel in ways neither could have imagined. The routine of the plantation was merciless, a ceaseless cycle of dawn and dusk marked by relentless toil and the ever-watchful eyes of overseers. The girl, though frail in appearance, bore within her a resilience forged from years of hardship and a heart that would not break entirely. Her presence stirred something buried deep within the baron, a complex knot of guilt, loss, and perhaps an elusive hope for redemption. Amidst the endless rows of cotton and the steady creak of wooden wagons, the story was just beginning to unravel, a tale of loss, power, and the unyielding bonds of blood. What secrets lay hidden in the depths of the baron's past? And could the fragile girl truly change the course of so much suffering, unshackling not only herself, but the man who had once laughed at her as the cheapest slave? As the sun dipped lower, staining the sky with hues of blood and fire, one question lingered in the gathering shadows. What would happen when the baron truly saw the girl before him, not as property, but as family? Before we follow their journey deeper into this dark and tangled history, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? What city holds you as you listen to this story unfold beneath that same relentless sun? The cotton fields, vast and unending, stretched like a sea of white under the merciless gaze of the afternoon sun, each fiber shimmering with the ghostly weight of lives tethered to the land, lives like that of the young girl, whose fragile frame moved with quiet determination through the rows. The baron's ear caught the faint rustle of her steps long before his eyes met hers, his sharp gaze dissecting the slender figure, as if trying to unravel a riddle he had not yet been prepared to confront. Though the authority of the plantation lord sat perched firmly upon his broad shoulders, beneath it something long repressed flickered, uncertain, trembling. It was in that moment, standing amidst the cotton stalks that seemed to whisper the echo of 1,000 stories long silenced, that the true battle began, not of brute force or commanding shouts, but of something infinitely more precarious, the reckoning of the heart. The young girl, her dark eyes alight with a flicker not merely of fear, but of fierce defiance, met the baron's stare without wavering. Her hands, though scarred from years of labor and abuse, clenched at a fragment of hope, a whisper of a past entwined with promises whispered beneath the hush of night, promises of family and freedom. To the baron, she was far more than the cheapest slave, the lowest coin traded in the cruel auction of human lives. She was, inexplicably, a living testament that the iron bars of his authority might bend, that history might indeed shift on its perilous axis. And yet the shadows of doubt loomed, as insidious as the relentless flies in the summer heat. Could he relinquish the cold, familiar chains of control that had bound not only his captives, but his very soul? The plantation itself seemed to breathe with the weight of these unspoken conflicts, the weathered rooms of the overseer's house holding the echoes of harsh commands and silent prayers alike. Inside, the baron's wife, the mistress of the house, moved with an uneasy grace, her eyes flickering with suspicion and anxiety, sensing the seismic shifts stirring within this volatile household. To her, the young girl was a threat, an unpredictable spark in the carefully ordered world where every thread of power and submission had its place. Yet beneath her steely exterior, the mistress grappled with her own sorrow, an unvoiced ache born of the same rotten soil that bore the cotton, losses inscribed in the delicate creases of her hands, betrayals buried deep beneath bridal silks and whispered secrets. As dusk descended and painted the horizon in strokes of violet and gold, conversations cracked open like fragile glass, confessions exchanged in voices barely above a whisper, laden with guilt and yearning. The young girl recounted fragments of her stolen childhood, the cruel severing of ties by hands, drenched in greed and indifference, and the whispered tales of a father lost in the fog of history, a man who had once held more than just the rights of a slave but the bonds of blood and belonging. The Baron listened, the veneer of imperious command flickering under the strain of suppressed memories. What had he lost in the twisting corridors of his own lineage? Could reckoning arrive in the form of this fragile visage? Night enveloped the plantation in shadows, heavy as mourning veils, the cicadas' chorus punctuating the silence where dreams and nightmares intertwined. Beneath the sprawling oak, where secrets were shared by flickering lantern light, the Baron and the young girl forged an uneasy truce born not of trust, but of the undeniable pull that tethered them beyond the cold laws of ownership. The past, with all its aching wounds, stretched wide between them, yet in its folds there glimmered the faint promise of redemption and reconciliation. The layered complexities of their connection became a mirror, reflecting the torments of a world still bound by chains far older than time. But the plantation held dangers far beyond the fragile hope nestled between master and slave. The overseer's glare was hard and unforgiving, a sentinel for the old order, poised to crush any hint of rebellion or compassion. Rumors, the kind that slithered like vipers through the quarters, spoke of secret meetings and whispered plans, of alliances forged in hushed defiance and fragile courage. Each day, as the sun carved long shadows across the cotton fields, the tension coiled tighter, a serpent ready to strike at the very heart of the Baron's estate. Was the young girl a catalyst for change, or a herald of doom for all who dwelled within this brutal landscape? The question now turns to you. What would you do standing at the crossroads of power and injustice, family and freedom? Could a single, fragile soul alter the course of a world entrenched in cruelty, or would the crushed hope of one only underscore the relentless suffering of so many? In the intimate quiet of a dimly lit cabin where the girl found fleeting sanctuary, the whispered stories of other lives interwove with her own, revealing the intricate tapestry of resistance and despair that pulsed through the slave quarters. Faces bore the strain of relentless toil and stolen dreams, yet eyes gleamed with the stubborn light of resilience, a testament to the human spirit's unyielding hunger for dignity even in the most grievous of chains. Here, amid crumbling walls scented with smoke and sweat, the young girl's silhouette mingled with shadows, her heart beating a rhythm matched only by the slow, steady drum of change. Simultaneously, the Baron grappled with memories he had long buried, glimpses of a childhood marked not by comfort, but by secrets wrapped in the intoxicating scent of magnolia and gunpowder. His own legacy of cruelty and power now clashed fiercely with the newfound kinship emerging with the girl whose blood seemed to pulse with a distant echo of his own. The boundaries between master and slave blurred, revealing the tangled roots of love and betrayal buried deep beneath the polished veneer of plantation grandeur. The Baron, haunted by his lineage and the spectres it summoned, stood at the precipice of a choice that could unravel everything, or perhaps finally redeem what had long seemed irredeemable. The days wore on, heavy with unspoken tension, as the plantation trembled on the cusp of transformation. Every intercepted glance, every whispered negotiation held the potential to ignite revolution or submission. The mistress observed with a heart simultaneously hardened and shattered, watching the fragile girl become a symbol not only of lost innocence, but of a burgeoning defiance that threatened the patriarchal fortress she had dutifully upheld. In her conflicted gaze, one could trace the ghost of compassion abandoned to necessity, and the cruel irony of empathy chained by circumstance. Meanwhile, beneath the massive limbs of ancient trees that cupped the restless skies, the young slave's resolve crystallized into a steadfast purpose. The fleeting moments of kindness, the stolen conversations beneath the cotton bowls, had awakened within her an unquenchable fire, a fierce longing not merely for freedom, but for acknowledgement, for the restoration of a fragmented family torn brutally apart. Her journey was no longer about mere survival, but about reclaiming identity, confronting the legacy of violence, and demanding a voice in a world determined to silence her. The plantation's hum of hooves on dirt roads, of chains rattling softly in the night, of whispered prayers and bitter curses, became the soundtrack of a brewing storm. The Baron's internal turmoil mirrored the roiling air, thick with the scent of imminent rain, and the tension of lives balanced precariously at the edge of change. What unseen forces tethered these two souls, master and slave, in a dance of power, pain, and an unspoken hope? The question echoed louder with every passing sunset, echoing like the knell of a distant bell tolling for an era slowly collapsing within itself. Strangers passed, unnoticed yet loaded with silent significance. Neighbors, traders, men whose faces were etched with the harsh lines of survival in a land built on exploitation and cruelty. Each carried fragments of news, bits of rumor that swirled into the plantation's fragile ecosystem of trust and suspicion. Whispers spoke of abolitionist movements creeping like shadows into the south, of murmurs from the city promising upheaval and new dawns. The world beyond the cotton fields was shifting, and the plantation's heart beat in uneasy rhythm with this turbulent change. As the nights grew longer and the air cooler with the approach of fall, the complex relationships within the estate, master and slave, mistress and servant, overseer and the enslaved, wove into a tapestry thick with longing, fear, and unspoken rebellion. The Baron found himself haunted by the quiet strength of the young girl, her silent courage casting a harsh light on the iron fist he had long wielded without question. Could the chains of history be broken? Could a man steeped in tradition learn to see beyond the facade of ownership to the fragile humanity beneath? The young girl's whispered hope pierced the darkness like a shard of glass, cutting, sharp, unyielding. She spoke not only for herself, but for those hidden in the shadows, for the stories drowned beneath the relentless tide of oppression. Her voice, though soft, echoed with power, a testament that even amidst the deepest despair, the human spirit finds a way to defy. The Baron listened, torn between the weight of inherited cruelty and the faintest flicker of a new future. So, as you sit with me now, surrounded by your own world so far removed from these fields of cotton and echoes of suffering, I ask again, whose story do you carry within? What legacies of pain and hope do you inherit? In your city, your home, your heart. This is not just the tale of one plantation or one family, but a mirror held up to the complexities of history and humanity itself. The shadows gather, but so too do the whispers of change. What would you do if the fragile bonds of blood and bondage were suddenly rewritten in your own life? In the heavy silence that weighed over the grand chamber of the Baron's estate, where opulence masked the moral decay beneath, a tempest of revelation brewed, a storm destined to shatter the brittle veneer of tradition and tyranny upon which the plantation was built. The Baron, a man whose lineage was steeped in the unquestioned dominion over human lives, found himself at the precipice of an unfathomable transformation. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, yet clouded with the haze of inherited prejudice, now bore witness to a truth as stark and relentless as the southern sun that scorched the cotton fields. It was in the dim glow of twilight, that poignant hour when day surrenders to night, that the young slave whom the world had seen merely as property, an object to be bought, sold, and commanded, stood boldly, no longer veiled in silence. Her voice, once a soft murmur beneath the crack of the overseer's whip and the master's callous commands, now rose with an almost ethereal clarity, cutting through the thick air like a blade honed on the whetstone of courage. Have you ever heard the tale of a life so entwined with another that to sever it would mean to unravel the very fabric of existence itself? She asked, piercing the solemn assembly with a gaze that dared to meet the Baron's own. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Never before had she been permitted to speak with such unguarded defiance. Yet what she revealed next was a secret so profound, so entangled with the personal and the political, that it unraveled the comfortable narratives upon which the plantation's power rested. The young slave confessed, her words trembling yet resolute, that beneath the veneer of master and servant lay a forbidden bond, a bloodline hidden like a shadow in the sun-drenched fields, a shared ancestry masked by the cruel divisions of race and status. This admission sent ripples through the room, unsettling the very pillars of the Baron's world. The revelation that the young slave was in fact his own kin, born of a clandestine union between the Baron's father and a woman whose name was erased from the annals of the family's pride, challenged the rigid social order that upheld the institution of slavery. The weight of this truth pressed upon the Baron's conscience, like the oppressive heat that smothered the land, igniting a fierce internal battle between the dictates of tradition and the dawning recognition of shared humanity. As the candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to animate the ghosts of the past, the young slave spoke of the hurt and longing etched into her very soul. Years of toil under the merciless gaze of overseers, nights spent dreaming of freedom, and the unbearable ache of belonging to a family that could not acknowledge her. Her narrative was not simply one of pain, but also of resilience, a testament to the indomitable spirit that clings to hope in the face of dehumanization. The Baron's eyes traveled over the faces of his confidants and slaves, now spectators to this unthinkable revelation. Faces hardened by years of complicity, some etched with disbelief, others flickering with fear or resentment. Yet, amidst the tumult, a tremor of empathy, perhaps even guilt, began to weave through the room. The man who had wielded absolute power over these people was confronted with a profound mirror reflecting his own fractured soul. This was the moment when the chasm between oppressor and oppressed seemed poised to collapse, birthing a fragile possibility of reconciliation or irreversible rupture. The young slave implored the Baron to reconsider the foundations of their existence, to envision a future where the chains that bound them could be broken, where blood, not color, would be the measure of kinship and justice. Can you, dear listener, imagine standing at the crossroads of such a reckoning? Have you ever heard a story that bends the contours of history and identity, forcing the powerful to confront the shadows woven into their own lineage? The plantation, with its endless rows of cotton, suddenly felt like a crucible where the old world met the dawn of something new and uncertain. The Baron's hands trembled imperceptibly as he grappled with the weight of his ancestors' sins and the undeniable truth laid bare before him. Pride wrestled fiercely with compassion, and for the first time in his life, he felt the corrosive loneliness of command challenged by the urgent whisper of kinship. His voice, usually as firm and cold as the iron shackles that bound the slaves, softened into a murmur, a confession and a plea for understanding. The young slave stepped forward, her posture a blend of defiance and vulnerability, as she recounted the stolen moments of tenderness between herself and the Baron's father, moments shadowed by secrecy, but luminous with humanity. She spoke of the stolen freedom of identity, the scars invisibly etched upon the souls of those deemed less than human, and the enduring hope that justice might yet bloom in the barren soil of their land. Outside, the murmurs of the cotton fields seemed to reach into the room, as if the earth itself was listening, bearing witness to this upheaval. In that charged silence, the Baron's heart beat with a rhythm no longer dictated by fear, but by the fragile thread of empathy stretching across the gulf of history. The old order trembled, fragile as a house of cards in a storm. The confidants of the Baron exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the narrative they had upheld was unraveling. Some saw the young slave's revelation as a threat, a dangerous injection of uncertainty that could ignite rebellion. Others felt the stirrings of an overdue awakening, a recognition that the future would demand a reckoning with truths long buried beneath the surface. As the night deepened, the Baron and the young slave stood united in that solemn chamber, the air thick with the weight of unspoken possibilities and the heavy scent of magnolia blossoms from the estate's gardens. They were bound, not by chains of ownership, but by the undeniable ties of blood and shared humanity. The question was no longer whether the old ways could persist, but whether the courage to break free from them had finally been found. What would you do if the very foundations of your world were shaken by such a revelation? Would you embrace the painful truth and seek a path to redemption, or cling desperately to the comforts of ignorance and power? This is not merely a tale of a forgotten plantation, but a reflection of the conflicts that shape all human hearts, the struggle to reconcile past sins with the hope for a better tomorrow. As the dawn approached, the young slave's words lingered like a hymn of resistance and grace, echoing through the halls and into the fields where generations had toiled and dreamed. The Baron, once a figure carved from the stone of tradition, now stood at a threshold illuminated by the fragile light of possibility. Their story, at once unique and universal, challenges us to confront the legacies we inherit and to ask ourselves, what narrative will we choose to carry forward? The plantation's shadows feel darker now, but within them flickers the unyielding flame of transformation. And in that flame, the promise of a new dawn. Have you ever heard a story that demands such a reckoning within your own soul, a narrative that unsettles the foundations you thought unshakable and invites you to imagine a truer, more just world? The journey does not end here. The echoes of this tale resound far beyond the fields of cotton, reaching into every heart willing to listen and change. As the first pale rays of dawn stretched their tentative fingers across the sprawling fields of cotton, casting a muted glow upon the earth, a profound stillness hung in the air, a quiet before a new beginning, pregnant with the weight of decisions that would ripple through the lives tethered to that land. Baron, once immutable in his convictions, now bore the unmistakable marks of a man gripped by an internal struggle as ceaseless and turbulent as the river that carved its path beyond the horizon. His gaze, previously hardened by the iron weight of inherited authority, softened with a dawning awareness that the old world was crumbling beneath the relentless march of conscience. The plantation, a realm once defined by the inexorable hierarchies of power and subjugation, was awakening to the fragile yet resolute stirrings of transformation. Baron's steps, deliberate and unshakable, led him toward the quarters where the young slave, the embodiment of resilience and unspoken dreams, waited, no longer as a mere possession, but as a human soul whose dignity demanded recognition. In this humility lay the genesis of a new order, fragile as the delicate cotton bolls, yet as vital as the air that caressed the weary earth. Their encounter was laden with an unspoken gravity, woven with threads of remorse, hope, and tentative trust. Baron, once a distant overseer of lives reduced to labor and obedience, now knelt not in submission to tradition, but in reverence for the shared humanity that bound them. The young slave, whose eyes bore witness to the cruelties inflicted by a merciless past, held fast to an ember of hope kindled by this unexpected gesture. In that moment, the rigid barriers of master and property dissolved, replaced by a nascent understanding that would chart the course for both their futures. The decision to dismantle the entwined chains of bondage was neither swift nor unchallenged. The weight of entrenched societal expectations pressed down with relentless force, threatening to smother the fragile flame of change. Yet Baron's conviction, once a fortress of denial, had been shattered and rebuilt into a beacon of courage. His proclamation, trembling but resolute, echoed across the fields. The young slave would no longer be bound by the shackles of servitude, but granted the freedom to carve a life unburdened by the legacy of oppression. News of this unprecedented act rippled through the community like a storm disrupting placid waters. Some met the revelation with scorn, their prejudices hardened by generations of unquestioned social order. Others, however, felt the stirrings of a suppressed conscience, as though the embers of their own concealed doubts had been fanned into a burgeoning flame. Baron's defiance of convention became a catalyst, prompting whispered conversations in dimly lit parlors and candlelit kitchens, sowing seeds of inquiry into the moral fabric of a society long mired in denial. The young slave's newfound liberty was both a triumph and a crucible. With freedom came uncertainty. The once predictable rhythms of plantation life gave way to the unpredictable currents of self-determination. Yet fortified by a spirit unbroken by years of hardship, he faced the horizon with a determination to claim his rightful place in a world that had so often denied him agency. His steps, tentative at first, grew steadier as he embraced the vast expanse of possibilities that stretched beyond the plantation's oppressive bounds. Baron, too, grappled with the profound implications of his choice. The legacy he left behind was no longer one etched in stone, but carried forward in the living tapestry of change. His interactions with those who remained bound by servitude evolved from commands barked across fields to dialogues infused with empathy and respect. Though the path ahead was strewn with challenges, economic, social, and personal, he resolved to shepherd this transformation with unwavering commitment. The plantation itself became a microcosm of the broader societal upheaval roiling the antebellum South. Formerly rigid hierarchies yielded to new dynamics, infused with the tumult of progress and resistance. Men and women, both enslaved and free, navigated this shifting landscape with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The cotton fields, once stained with the sweat of involuntary labor, now bore witness to a tentative collaboration predicated on mutual recognition rather than dominion. Economic consequences loomed large, threatening to unmoor the plantation's stability. Freed from the chains of coerced labor, the community confronted the daunting task of forging sustainable livelihoods amidst a system predicated on exploitation. Barron's willingness to invest in equitable labor arrangements, education, and the fostering of communal bonds marked a radical departure from the status quo. Though met with skepticism by many, these efforts planted the seeds of a more just and resilient social order. Within the intimate confines of the quarters once reserved for the enslaved, transformations unfolded as well. Families, long fractured by the caprices of ownership and sale, sought to restore ties severed by systemic cruelty. The young slave, now a symbol of possibility, became a beacon for others yearning to reclaim their humanity. His story, embroidered with trials and triumphs, offered a narrative that transcended the plantation's boundaries, echoing in distant towns and countrysides as a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who dared to dream of freedom. This narrative rippled outward, touching hearts ensnared in the complacency of tradition. Visitors to the plantation bore witness to the evolving customs, absorbing lessons etched in the courage of transformation. Letters and journals penned by those moved by this story spread its influence, stirring conversations that transcended class, race, and region. The young slave's journey from bondage to autonomy became emblematic of a larger reckoning, brewing in the veins of a nation teetering on the cusp of profound change. Amidst the looming clouds of national discord, the plantation's quiet revolution embodied a microcosm of the conflicting forces that would soon convulse the United States. Here, in the hushed fields and shaded porches, the battle for the soul of a nation played out in intimate acts of defiance and compassion. Barron's courage, born from introspection and grace, illuminated a path fraught with peril yet laden with the promise of redemption. The community's response was a mosaic of resistance and embrace, skepticism and hope. Some clung desperately to the familiar trappings of power, attempting to stifle the encroaching tides of change with laws and violence. Others, inspired by the transformation unfolding before them, sought to build bridges of understanding and justice. This tension infused the plantation with a dynamic energy, as the old structures creaked under the strain of new aspirations. Amidst this turmoil, relationships deepened and evolved. Bonds forged in mutual respect and shared hardship replaced those built on dominion and fear. The young slave and baron, once divided by insurmountable divides, now stood united in their commitment to a vision that transcended their own stories. Their alliance became a testament to the possibility of reconciliation and the genesis of a future unshackled from the sins of the past. Education flourished as a cornerstone of this new era. Workshops and informal schools sprouted amidst the quarters, offering the promise of literacy and learning long denied. Barron's support for these endeavors signaled a radical reprioritization, one that recognized knowledge as the key to empowerment and societal transformation. The young slave, eager to absorb the wisdom once obscured from his grasp, embraced this opportunity with the fervor of one who understood that liberation was as much intellectual as it was physical. The land itself seemed to respond to the shifting tides, the cotton fields waving not only with the wind, but with newfound vitality born of fair labor and shared purpose. Harvests, once harvested under duress, were now reaped by hands recognizing their own worth and dignity. The fruits of their labor nourished bodies and spirits alike, sowing hope for generations yet unborn. Yet even as progress unfolded, shadows lingered, ghosts of oppression and sorrow that could not be easily exorcised. Trauma, etched deeply into the collective memory, demanded acknowledgement and healing. Barron undertook the solemn task of confronting this history, facilitating spaces for remembrance and restitution. The community's willingness to engage in this painful reckoning further cemented the authenticity of their transformation. In time, the plantation emerged not as a relic shackled by the past, but as a beacon of resilience and renewal. Its story rippled outward, an enduring testament to the power of empathy, courage, and the unyielding human desire for freedom. This legacy challenged the prevailing narratives of its era, inscribing a counterpoint of hope into the annals of a tumultuous history. The young slave's journey from the depths of subjugation to the heights of self-determination became a narrative retold through whispered testimonials and written word, a clarion call that transcended the confines of geography and circumstance. Baron, once a symbol of entrenched hierarchies, redefined himself through his unwavering pursuit of justice and grace. As the sun rose higher, casting golden hues upon the transformed landscape, it illuminated not only the cotton fields, but also the enduring flame of human dignity, rekindled within hearts long subdued. The plantation's shadows, once impenetrable, now bore traces of light, fingers of hope that reached toward a horizon where the promise of freedom no longer flickered, but blazed with unwavering intensity. And so, the tale of Baron and the young slave concluded not with the finality of an ending, but with the stirring of new chapters, inscribed by those willing to confront their past, embrace the complexity of change, and forge a world where justice and humanity entwined like the roots of ancient oaks, stretching deep into the earth, unbreakable and eternal. Their journey beckons us still, urging an unflinching reckoning, and the courage to carry forward a narrative imbued with truth, compassion, and the boundless possibility of redemption. Decades had finally passed, and the relentless march of time had eroded many of the harshest vestiges of a world once marred indelibly by chains and subjugation. The great cotton plantations of the antebellum South, with their sprawling fields shimmering beneath a relentless sun, a sun that had borne silent witness to countless acts of cruelty and resistance, stood transformed, repurposed by the tides of emancipation and the tremors of societal upheaval. Where the heavy footfalls of overseers had once stirred the dust into choking clouds, now the whispers of the past lingered like fading echoes, inviting reflection yet demanding reckoning. Baron's plantation, emblematic of both tyranny and the embers of change, bore silent testament to this metamorphosis. The land that had known the bitter toil of enslaved souls had become a canvas for a new narrative, an uncomfortable yet necessary dialogue between history and hope. Long after Baron and the young slave had severed the unnatural bonds that had bound them, life continued in channels both familiar and unfathomable. The young slave, whose spirit had refused to be extinguished beneath the weight of ownership, grew into a figure whose legacy was etched not in the annals of the oppressor, but whispered among generations of freedmen and women. His story, carried by word of mouth, by the cracked lips of elders perched upon creaking porches, was passed along with reverence, an elegy to human resilience and a clarion call to justice. Baron's own trajectory was more convoluted. The burden of conscience, once a faint, ignorable discomfort, had grown into a gnawing spectre that haunted his remaining years, compelling him to pen reflective memoirs that spoke with candor about the moral abyss he had once inhabited. In the broader societal tapestry, the echoes of slavery did not dissipate with the stroke of a pen or the passing of legislation. The scars etched upon the collective psyche ran deep, embedded in customs, economics, and an often unspoken hierarchy that lingered like a persistent shadow. Communities struggled to reconcile the raw brutality of their history with the idealism of freedom, and the task was monumental. The Emancipation Proclamations and constitutional amendments that legally abolished slavery were but initial threads in a sprawling, intricate web that sought to reweave a fractured social fabric. The emancipation, while momentous, unleashed a flood of complexities, questions of identity, belonging, and reparations that would ripple through decades and continue demanding a reckoning. Moreover, the philosophical underpinnings of human dignity, once so brazenly denied, began to ascend from the rubble of oppression, illuminated by the tireless activism and intellectual labor of those formerly enslaved and their allies. The very notion that all humans possess an innate worth, impervious to race or station, began to seep into the collective consciousness. Yet, the journey was arduous and far from linear. Racism, segregation, and economic disparities erected formidable barriers that sought to undermine this nascent recognition of equality. The young slaves' descendants and those of countless others navigated this treacherous terrain, balancing survival with the quest for recognition, their lives testaments to both endurance and the unyielding hunger for justice. The plantation itself, reconsidered through the lens of history, became a crucible where memory contended with myth. It was no longer just a site of forced labor, but transformed into a locus of education and remembrance, a somber monument where stories of suffering and resistance coalesced to confront future generations. Barron's estate was converted into a historical landmark, its walls imbued with narratives that refused to sanitize the past, but instead demanded an honest confrontation with it. Visitors, scholars, and descendants alike would walk its grounds, navigating the uneasy intersection of reverence and reckoning. This transformation underscored a profound truth, that history, when confronted rather than concealed, possesses a power to heal, to educate, and to awaken conscience. Yet even as these tangible markers served as anchors to the past, the intangible legacies were equally potent. The philosophical discourse around freedom and humanity deepened, fueled by the collective trauma and triumph intertwined with the era. The recognition that human dignity is an unassailable right, not a privilege bestowed by birth or circumstance, took root in jurisprudence, literature, and art, reshaping cultural paradigms. The young slave's life, and the master's eventual confrontation with his own complicity, became allegorical, symbols in a moral tale that transcended their era, urging perpetual vigilance against the corrosive forces of dehumanization. In reflecting upon these developments, one perceives an indelible lesson etched into the very sinews of American history, that freedom once granted is but the inception of a far more arduous journey, a pilgrimage toward genuine equality, recognition, and healing. The promise of emancipation, radiant yet fragile, demanded centuries of struggle and unyielding courage to approximate fulfillment. It revealed the complexity of human nature, wherein the capacity for cruelty and compassion, oppression and redemption coexist in uneasy tension. The sustained effort to dismantle entrenched systems of injustice became humanity's collective imperative, a mission entrusted to each succeeding generation. The young slave's lineage flourished in the face of adversity, weaving narratives of accomplishment and contribution that punctuated the evolving American story. Education, civil rights activism, and cultural expression became intertwined instruments of emancipation, embodying a triumph of spirit over circumstance. Their stories challenged reductive portrayals of victimhood, asserting agency and dignity with unwavering clarity. These descendants, standing upon the battered yet resilient foundations erected by forebears, carried forward the cumbersome torch of liberation, illuminating paths toward equity even amid persistent shadows of discrimination. Simultaneously, Barron's descendants faced a reckoning of their own, a confrontation with the legacies of privilege and guilt inherited from ancestors. Some embraced this burden, transforming inherited wealth into vehicles for social justice and restitution, contributing to dialogues around reparations and reconciliation. Others wrestled privately with conflicted emotions, confronting the disparity between inherited prosperity and the historic suffering that facilitated it. Such personal reckonings mirrored a wider societal confrontation with complicity, privilege, and the responsibilities borne not only by those oppressed, but by the beneficiaries of systemic injustice. The plantation's physical evolution mirrored these profound shifts. Overgrown fields once cultivated by forced labor gave way to arboreal sanctuaries, gardens of reflection where the natural world reclaimed narratives of suffering with quiet majesty. Statues and plaques, once absent or defaced, emerged alongside interpretive centers dedicated to telling unvarnished truths. This spatial reimagining fortified the ethical framework essential for remembrance without glorification, preserving memory while fostering empathy. It echoed a collective acknowledgement that history must neither be erased nor weaponized, but instead serve as a mirror reflecting humanity's potential for darkness and light. In the philosophical crucible of the 20th and 21st centuries, the dialogue surrounding human dignity, justice, and reconciliation expanded globally, informed by the legacy of slavery and its abolition in the American South. International human rights movements drew from the wellspring of these narratives, recognizing the universal imperative to safeguard the intrinsic worth of every individual. The young slave's story, immortalized in oral traditions, literary works, and historical scholarship, transcended parochial boundaries, contributing to an ever-widening discourse on freedom, dignity, and the enduring struggle against oppression in its multifarious forms. Yet, the persistence of racial inequalities, systemic barriers, and cultural tensions served as stark reminders that the ideals kindled in those transformative decades remained elusive in full measure. This reality ensured that the epilogue of Baron and the Young Slave is not a denouement, but an ongoing chapter, an open-ended narrative that challenges complacency and demands engagement. The shadows of the past serve not only to warn, but to galvanize, inspiring continual efforts to dismantle injustice and cultivate societies where freedom is not a possession, but a birthright, where dignity is recognized in every human interaction. The young slave's emancipation signified a rupture, a severing of physical chains, but the more intricate bondage of systemic inequality persisted, manifesting in voting restrictions, economic disenfranchisement, and cultural marginalization. The philosophical discourse surrounding these dynamics matured with agonizing nuance. It compelled acknowledgement that true freedom entails more than legal status. It demands economic opportunity, political inclusion, and cultural affirmation. The sprawling plantations, once symbols of bondage, thus offer an ironic metaphor. Fertile grounds capable of nurturing either oppression or flourishing, depending on the stewardship exercised by those who till their soil. In contemplating Baron's transformation, from a man embodying the oppressive system to one humbled by the insurmountable weight of conscience, one perceives the complexities of moral evolution. His story embodies the fraught dialectic between complicity and redemption, underscoring humanity's capacity for both grievous error and profound growth. His introspective writings catalyzed dialogue, challenging complacency among contemporaries and successors alike, reminding that the journey toward justice is propelled by self-awareness and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Generations later, the echoes of his sorrowful reflections and the young slave's unwavering spirit coalesced into a tapestry of remembrance and resistance. The descendants of both, bound together through history's intricate weft, engaged in gestures of reconciliation, collaborative memorials, and social activism. These initiatives underscored a fundamental insight, that healing is forged through dialogue, acknowledgement, and shared commitment to a future unburdened by past transgressions. This mutual engagement redefined legacies, transforming sites of pain into arenas of shared humanity. The ephemeral, almost intangible awakening of hope, glimpsed in the plantation's shadows during Baron's lifetime, burgeoned into a radiant flame, sustained across epochs by the persistence of memory and moral reckoning. The promise of freedom, once wavering and tentative, solidified into a beacon, guiding communities through upheavals, inspiring movements for civil rights, and shaping cultural expressions that celebrated resilience amid adversity. It became evident that the struggle for dignity and justice, born in the crucible of slavery and emancipation, continues to inspire universal aspirations for a more ethical and just world. Thus, the narrative carved by Baron and the Young Slave refuses simplicity or closure. It resists being neatly packaged into triumph or tragedy, instead embracing complexity, contradiction, and ongoing transformation. Their intertwined fates embody a profound philosophical meditation, that history is neither a distant chronicle nor a static monument, but a living dialogue, an invitation to continuous reflection, engagement, and moral courage. Theirs is a story both particular and universal, a testament that within the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit can kindle light that illuminates generations yet unborn. In this light, the plantation emerges less as a relic of oppression than as a canvas on which humanity's perennial struggles and hopes are etched. Its soil, rich with the sweat, tears, and dreams of countless lives, implores us to honor all facets of its story, to listen, to remember, and above all to act with empathy and justice. Therein lies the true legacy passed down from Baron, the young slave, and the myriad souls whose lives intersected in those fields beneath the oppressive sun. Our reflection must recognize that freedom is not an endpoint, but a perpetual horizon, ever receding, yet eternally beckoning. The echoes of chains broken, cries for justice, and whispered prayers for dignity reverberate still through the corridors of time. They compel each generation to wrestle anew with the enduring questions. What does it mean to be truly free? How does one reconcile with the sins of the past? And what acts of courage and compassion are required to ensure that history's darkest chapters yield enduring enlightenment rather than perpetual sorrow? In embracing these inquiries, the enduring saga of Baron and the young slave transforms from a mere historical account into a living moral compass. It challenges us not only to observe but to participate, to engage with our histories candidly, to confront injustice wherever it persists, and to foster societies where every individual's humanity is recognized and cherished. Through such commitment, the shadows of the plantation give way to dawns imbued with possibility, where dignity reigns not as privilege, but as birthright, and freedom flourishes not as an ideal deferred, but as a tangible reality. Such is the legacy entrusted to us, the sacred charge to remember without rancor, to learn without complacency, and to forge a future radiating with empathy, justice, and unyielding respect for the inalienable worth of every soul. The story of Baron and the young slave endures, its echoes woven into the living fabric of humanity's ongoing journey toward redemption and grace, a journey whose horizon, though ever distant, beckons with the promise of light eternal.